Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. And I just want to thank y'all for joining us. My name is Megan. I'm with Dynalink Networks. I'm one of our marketing assistants, and I'm just going to go over a few things about the session today. So the session will be recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to this recording along with copies of the slides after the webinar in a follow-up email. And throughout the presentation, we will be launching polls, and we really suggest that you for your engagement because we will be doing a swag giveaway to those who participate. So keep an eye out for those. And then you can also submit questions at any time during the webinar through the Q&A feature, and we'll be saving those questions for the end during the Q&A portion. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Morgan, also with DataLink.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Morgan Oglesby, and I'm a business development representative with Datalink Networks. We are so excited to have you here today, and I'm going to just go over a quick little overview of Datalink Networks and our partnership with CoreView. So, David, if you want to take it to the next slide. So, we have been providing managed services and IT solutions for over 30 years. We're headquartered in Santa Clarita, California, with a southern HQ in Bentonville, Arkansas. We are a national managed service provider, and we specialize in managed services, cybersecurity, cloud, AI, hardware procurement, networking, data centers, and of course, Microsoft. And so our mission is to help organizations streamline and secure their IT environments. And our partnership with CoreView has been crucial in helping companies manage their Microsoft 365 environments more effectively. So we're thrilled to have David Nevins with us today. He's a product innovation specialist at CoreView, and he's going to walk us through best practices for managing M365 configurations. And with that, I'll be passing it over to David.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Megan. And thanks everyone today for joining. Really looking forward to this session discussing security, particularly how that pertains to configuration management for Microsoft 365. And so just a quick introduction about myself, folks. Of course, my name is David. I'm one of the original founders of Simian Cloud, which is now known as CoreView Configuration Manager. We recently, about a year ago, merged the two companies together and rebranded the Simian Cloud component product as CoreView Configuration Manager, since the focus of Simian really is that Microsoft 365 configuration management. My experience ranges from being in the MSP world to designing and implementing complex IT solutions in the enterprise space, particularly around Microsoft 365 management. And I've that ranges from MSP to software development to enterprise solutions. So really broad range of experience, and looking forward to this presentation today. And of course, at the end, we will have some time reserved for a Q&A. So the idea today is that we'll be doing a brief presentation on automated configuration management and how that pertains to Microsoft 365 security. And that will be followed by a Q&A and then a demo of the CoreView Configuration Manager product to show you how you can automate your Microsoft 365 configurations and do that with automation instead of manually, and what the benefits are there. So while we do have time dedicated for the Q&A at the end, please don't hesitate to send any questions as they come up in the chat here. Unless Megan and Morgan, there's another way we would like to field questions. I think the chat is open for that.
Yeah, the chat's great.
Excellent. So please feel free to send questions as we go, and I will keep an eye on Teams there. And then if I can answer it and weave it into the presentation, I will. Otherwise, we can save that for the end. So without further ado, folks, we do have a couple polls just to get started here and really to provide some context about the presentation here. And so the first question is very general about your personal and business usage of Microsoft 365. So really the poll question here is, which parts or which components of Microsoft 365 are you currently using?
And it looks like the most answered is going to be Office 365, as well as all of the above.
Yes, so I can see that here. Excuse me for looking down, folks. I'm using my phone as a third screen here today. But yep, it looks like some Office 365, some all the above. All the above is excellent, folks, because it shows that people are fully leveraging their licenses, right? Where we have people using Entra ID, Intune, Office 365, and Defender. And so that really means that automation is best suited, for your needs. Because if you're just using Office 365, or let's say you're just getting into Intune, automation is still really important. But as you adopt all the different components of Microsoft 365, managing it becomes much more difficult, and thus automation becomes much more important. So that's very helpful information. It sounds like everyone we're talking to here is really familiar with Microsoft 365 and all the different components. And one more poll, folks, before we jump into the presentation. How does your organization manage your Microsoft 365 configurations today? So our answers, again, how does your organization manage Microsoft 365 configurations today? Is it manually managed, where you're going into the different tenant portals and adding and changing configurations, or using some automation, such as maybe some basic PowerShell scripts? There's also some open source projects out there. We have fully automated, which would be having either an internally built solution, like your own pipelines in DevOps, your PowerShell scripts, and that's a fully automated, comprehensive solution that you've been able to build, or you have a third-party solution and you're fully automated, such as Simian Cloud or CoreView Configuration Manager. And then, of course, we have not automated and not automated but want to, for those who are aspiring to get some automation in their Microsoft 365 configuration practice. Take a moment to complete that poll, folks. Looks like some answers are pouring in. We have so far we have about a third of our respondents saying manually, which is not a huge surprise considering, the lack of different tools out there to automate this, right? CoreView Configuration Manager really is on the cutting edge here. And then we do have some automation for the rest of our respondents. Excellent. All right, folks. So it sounds like, just to summarize these two polls, and thank you everyone for responding to those two polls. This provides really helpful context for the presentation here. It looks like everyone we're talking to today really is leveraging all the different features in Microsoft 365, which really suggests that automation is going to be really important to you. And in terms of automation today, it seems that about a third of the people here are not automating their configuration management at all, while the other 2/3 have some automation. And really the goal of the presentation today is to explain automated configuration management to you and how that is the future of Microsoft 365 security. So my hope is that by the end of the presentation and demo today, you all will leave confident about what it means to automate your Microsoft 365 configuration management practice and how to do that. And we will, have a call to action at the end here where you can actually get your hands on CoreView Configuration Manager and implement this in your environment. So of course, folks, today we are discussing the future of Microsoft 365 security and how that lies in automated configuration management. Now, to provide some context about Microsoft 365 configuration management, I think we need to take a step back and look at how configurations are managed today. And so we do have a mass adoption of Microsoft 365 for productivity and security. We've seen this across the largest organizations in the world, including today, right? We're on Teams, we're constantly using Microsoft 365. Our initial poll even suggested that all the companies here today are using Microsoft 365 for productivity and security. And the work from home trend with COVID-19 really did accelerate this, right? Our reliance on Microsoft 365. The work from home trend forced a lot of IT people's hand in terms of turning to Intune to be able to manage the remote workforce securely and manage all of those devices securely. So it's certainly, no more of a prevalent time when your configurations matter. And so as people are adopting Microsoft 365, we're faced with the many admin portals, tons of different settings and configurations that we are tasked with managing manually. Now, Microsoft, of course, does have some tools like Lighthouse. They even have an open source project, which I'll talk about in a little bit, called Microsoft 365 DSC. But again, IT admins are tasked with managing Intune, Entra ID, Office 365, Defender, SharePoint, Teams, the list goes on. All of those configurations and settings, and frankly, natively, you're left to do it manually. And so this opens up a lot of issue because manual configuration is error prone. It takes a lot of time. Your configurations drift from the desired state, and this causes preventable data breaches. I believe, the next bullet I have here is stating that misconfiguration is in fact the #1 cause of data breaches. This is pretty commonly known in the industry, where a misconfiguration, or if we think of Midnight Blizzard, a service principal that should not have been there was there, a misconfiguration causes a data breach. So again, folks, to summarize here, we have mass Microsoft 365 adoption. This requires secure configuration and setting, which today is very difficult, time consuming, and people are doing it manually, which is extremely error prone. And we're seeing that misconfiguration is the #1 cause of data breaches. This is avoidable, folks. And what is the answer? Automation. So something a little cheesy I like to say about automation is that not only is it quick, but it's also correct. So of course, when people think automation, one of the first things we think about is time savings, and that's great, right? How can we reallocate hours or save time, right? My engineer today is spending 20, 30 hours setting up new tenants or bringing on new tenants into our standard of configurations, and I want to reduce that down to 15 minutes, right? That's great. You can reallocate those 20, 30 hours elsewhere. But to me, the most important thing about automation is doing things correctly. Having confidence that you know the state of your tenant configuration. And frankly, the only way to do that is with automation. Today, a lot of people have an Excel sheet or they have an idea in their mind of how a tenant should be configured, and they're doing that manually. There's really no way of knowing today that your tenant is configured the way that you want it to be without CoreView Configuration Manager. And again, folks, please feel free to send any questions in the chat as we go. I'm just going to take a quick look. I can see someone is saying this is a particular issue of concern for you, specifically Microsoft 365 management aspect. Certainly agree, and that's really the idea behind designing the solution, was that we, I was involved with running an MSP, and we were involved with a lot of different financial institutions who were facing an issue with managing Intune in particular. So CoreView Configuration Manager was particularly designed around Intune configuration management originally. And we realized, all right, this, is a huge issue for MSPs and internal IT enterprises alike. And that is where CoreView Configuration Manager came from. So moving on, folks, again, automation is the answer. It is quick and correct. So how are people managing their configurations today? Obviously, we mentioned manual configuration management. And what I mean by this is, let's say you are a MSP and you're taking on a new client. You need to get that new client tenant up to speed with your standard of configurations. Or maybe you're taking on a new client and they have a new tenant. Or maybe you are internal IT and you're spinning up a new tenant. Today, people need to go into that tenant and manually configure the tenant into Azure AD Office 365 in the way that you want it to be configured. And then after you spend that time configuring it, there's really no way to check and confirm that it is configured in the desired state. Whereas with automation, you can automate that initial setup and then make sure over time that it remains the same. So really we're taking this crawl, walk, run approach here where the crawling is the manual configuration management, right? That's where we all start in the beginning. And then starting to walk toward the best practice of automating your config management, we have PowerShell. So this is really the first step toward automating where you can find some PowerShell scripts online, right across Reddit and the different online communities have provided lots of PowerShell. You can even learn PowerShell yourself and write basic scripting to, say, automate the setup of certain configurations and settings, or even to read from the tenant. You can even produce a report to try to see if it's configured the way you want it to be. But PowerShell really only gets you so far. The biggest limitation with PowerShell scripting is typically that it is unidirectional. So a PowerShell script will typically work in one direction. Of course, you can have much more sophisticated PowerShell scripts that are more comprehensive, but for the sake of this presentation and what I've really seen as people start to adopt PowerShell is that the biggest limitation is that it's unidirectional. And by unidirectional, I mean that it either writes to the tenant or it reads from the tenant. And so, why is that important? If you're only writing to the tenant, and let's say you have 10 configurations you want to write, you write that to the tenant. Okay, now my PowerShell script says it ran successfully, but you don't now have a check in that script to read it back and make sure that that is how your tenant is configured at the end of running your PowerShell script. The other thing is that I have to work in PowerShell. I can't work in the portals, in the tenants that I'm familiar with, in the UI that I'm familiar with. I have to work in code, write a PowerShell script, and deploy it to the tenant, and then I can read from the tenant, right? So really two limitations there. One is that I have to work in code, so I'm working unidirectionally from code to the tenant, pushing to the tenant. Or, it could be unidirectional in the sense that I'm reading from the tenant, right? So you have that unidirectional operation, and what changes that often is a solution like CoreView Configuration Manager, and I will get into that more. But again, folks, we have manual config management in terms of crawling, and then as we start to walk toward automation, we have PowerShell with its known limitations. And as we get even more advanced, we have configuration as code. People may be familiar with the term DevOps, CI/CD, that's continuous integration, continuous development. And the idea here is that we are developing, and again, this could be, I'll just hit the next bullet here. This could be in-house and third-party solutions, right? So an in-house solution could consist of PowerShell. Also, an in-house solution could consist of DevOps, CI/CD, using pipelines and repositories to manage your tenant configurations in code. And configuration as code is a step beyond PowerShell. Configuration as code can use PowerShell, but this concept of configuration as code is that instead of managing each of your tenants individually in the user interface, we're actually exporting the tenant into code, into JSON, where we can more easily work on your tenant configurations. And then we are deploying that back out to the tenant. And so, of course, this can have the similar limitation to PowerShell where it's unidirectional, where we have to export into code, then we can work in code and deploy back to the tenant. But it can also be bidirectional, where we can make it so we can work in the tenant and work in code, and those are able to sync between each other. But the basic idea of configuration as code is that instead of managing your configurations in the user interface, we are actually exporting that into code, able to edit it in code, or let's say we can export into code, have a configuration in one tenant, copy it to another tenant, and deploy it back out to the tenant. So the idea of configuration as code, again, is that we are representing each of our tenants in code, which enables us to more flexibly and have more scale in terms of managing our tenant configurations. Now, DevOps is, of course, the practice here. A lot of companies are using Microsoft's Azure DevOps to run their pipelines and host their repositories, their approvals, their RBAC. Some people are using GitHub Actions, which is very similar. All of these platforms are really just able to store code and execute code. So that's where we're storing our data and where we're running our jobs. And then CI/CD, excuse me, continuous integration, continuous development. We are regularly running our pipelines and running our synchronizations to ensure that we have the most up-to-date state of the tenant. And of course, running would be a fully built out in-house or adopting a third-party solution. And so I've encountered many organizations that have teams that are developing in-house solutions like this, right? Maybe they're just developing some PowerShell, or maybe they're developing a very complex and sophisticated DevOps tool to achieve configuration as code and automation of their Microsoft 365 configurations. And I would say 99 or even 100% of the time, the organizations I encounter that are developing or have developed in-house solutions will still want to switch to a third-party solution because of the management piece. That's really the biggest issue that we see with individuals running PowerShell scripts or developing their own, comprehensive internal solutions, is that maintaining it is extremely difficult, and it really does require a team. And this is, of course, because of the nature of Microsoft's API releases. And I think we can all relate to the difficult cycle of Microsoft's releases, even just in the user interfaces, right? Sometimes things are announced and other times some changes are not announced. And that's typically the case with the APIs. And so we have developed a very strong way of staying on top of the API changes to be made aware of them within minutes of their release and then handle it in our software. Whereas the people that I encounter in the industry trying to develop their own solutions are often faced with the difficulty of the navigating the complexity of those updates with the Microsoft APIs. And so third-party solutions consist of Microsoft's open source project called Microsoft 365 DSC. And really the other primary third-party solution is us, CoreView Configuration Manager. And that's really the only paid configuration as code solution in the Microsoft 365 configuration management space. The other solution, again, would be Microsoft's open source project, which I emphasize open source project because there's obviously, as we all know, a huge difference between a paid product and an open source project in terms of how well-rounded the product is in terms of support. And so a lot of people today are turning to CoreView Configuration Manager for their needs. Now, one thing I want to emphasize about configuration as code is that not only do we get the automation, automated management of your Microsoft 365 configurations, but we also get a backup of your Microsoft 365 configurations in code. And so that's a really important piece to point out, because what this enables us to do, and I might as well switch to the next slide here, explaining configuration as code. But what this enables us to do is really monitoring, reporting, backup, and restore of our configurations. And so I just want to take a step back here and emphasize really the definition of configuration as code, which is, as we said before, the practice of describing, provisioning, and managing settings with code. Right. So instead of working in the user interface, we are provisioning and managing settings with code. And so what are the benefits of this? The first, of course, is automation. And the benefits of automation are time savings and doing things correctly. If you're doing something manually, there's really no way of having 100% confidence that it is done correctly. And along with that comes consistency. So if you're managing multiple tenants and you're managing those tenants individually, it's really impossible to know for sure that those tenants are configured the same. Whereas with a configuration as code solution, you can establish a baseline set of configurations to ensure that all of the configurations across your different tenants are consistent, that they are the same. As I mentioned before, we have the ability to backup and restore. That's a byproduct of configuration as code. And so here I've written version control. So you can see what has changed in your tenant. When was it changed? Who changed it? And you have the ability to undo that change or revert to a point in time. So with a solution like CoreView Configuration Manager, you can cherry pick. You can say, hey, I want to compare my tenant today against my tenant a week ago and see how it's changed in the past week. Okay, I want to undo these two changes, or I want to revert completely to a week ago. This is huge in terms of being able to keep your tenant in the desired state, whether you change something on purpose that needs to be reverted or someone accidentally or maliciously changed something. Version control is really hand in hand with drift, preventing drift, and we'll get into that in a little bit. We also have change management. So today, a lot of people have dev, test, and production tenants, and those dev and test tenants are really not replicas of production. And so dev and test are not really these valid non-production environments, right? Because a valid test environment would be a replica of production. So we can actually test how something would perform in production. And so with configuration as code, we are able to create replicas of production for dev, test, orchestration, test those configurations, and then use our automation with configuration as code to click, hey, I want to copy or move this from dev to test, and then I want to move it from test to production. So we can have replica production environments for valid testing and staging, and then we can use our automation to move that exact configuration along the life cycle from dev to test to production. And we also have auditing and reporting. This is huge. We can see reporting on configuration changes and auditing on who, what, where, and when was changed. So we can generate reports and really just have transparency into what is changing in our tenant. And folks, please do feel free to send any questions in the chat. We can take a look at that in a moment. It looks like we had a couple questions, and feel free to send those. I will answer those at the end of this presentation. And so why is configuration as code important? Of course, we covered a number of these reasons, and really, as we said before, misconfiguration is the #1 cause of data breaches, and configuration as code helps us prevent that with things like baselines. With configuration as code and with PowerShell, these third-party and in-house solutions, we can develop what we refer to as a baseline. And a baseline is your golden standard. It's your template of Microsoft 365 configurations for how you want your tenant to be configured. And so a baseline paired with a configuration as code solution, such as CoreView Configuration Manager, helps us ensure that our tenant remains in the desired state configuration. So it helps us avoid misconfiguration. And along with that comes drift. So CoreView Configuration Manager will actually notify you when your tenant configuration drifts from the desired state and enable you to very easily go back to a point in time, undo that change, and get back into compliance with your desired state. So of course we have compliance with our baseline, and we have compliance with certain standards like CIS, NIST, HIPAA, CMMC. So, right, a lot of people today, and I think even more and more every day, people are tasked with managing certain compliance standards which do have a configuration component, and you really need a tool to help make sure that those configurations are initially deployed in the state you want them to be, and that they remain configured as such over time. And of course, you know, the holy grail here is backup, folks. Today, there is no real way to back up all of your Microsoft 365 configurations and have a way to go back to that point in time and restore from that backup. With CoreView Configuration Manager, you have a regular backup of your Microsoft 365 configurations with the ability to revert to a point in time. Some folks, misconfiguration, Microsoft 365 misconfiguration is the #1 cause of data breaches, and we've covered here today that automation is the way to avoid misconfiguration. And the key concept there is desired state configuration. So we use automation to ensure that our configurations remain in the desired state initially and over time, which helps us avoid misconfiguration, which in turn helps us avoid data breaches, avoidable data breaches. So folks, please feel free to send any questions in the chat at this point as I wrap up my presentation here and before we get into the demo. We have one more poll question. Now that we've covered a lot on Microsoft 365 configuration automation and security, I have a poll for everyone. How confident are you that your Microsoft 365 configurations are adequately providing security for your tenants? So how confident are you in your Microsoft 365 configuration? Some responses are pouring in. We have a scale from 1 to 5. Again, folks, how confident are you that your Microsoft 365 configurations are adequately providing security for your tenants? If we could get everyone to answer that, we have a few responses so far. Looks like most are scoring. We have an average of a 3.1 out of 5. So we have about 50% or so, a little more than 50% are confident that your configurations are adequately providing security for your tenants. And they might be, but you just don't have transparency into that. And so this is really why a automation solution is so important, folks. Please feel free to take another moment or two to answer the poll. All right, I guess we can close that poll out. And so we did a 3.1 average out of 5. Right, folks? So that would suggest about 62% confidence that our Microsoft 365 configurations are adequately providing security for your tenants. I think we want to be more than 62% confident. If we need to get as close as possible to 100% confidence that we know how our tenants are configured and that they are configured in such a way that provides security for our tenants. Most importantly, because that's our job. Most likely, if you're on this call, that is, a part of our job is making sure we have secure configuration, but it also provides peace of mind. In this industry, it really does provide peace of mind knowing how your tenants are configured. So folks, before we get into a brief demo of CoreView Configuration Manager, I did want to open it up to a Q&A. So I know we have a bunch of attendees here. Feel free to send any questions at all. I see one that came in here. Bear with me for just one moment. I'm again using my phone as a third screen. It looks like a comment here that we have emphasizing really how PowerShell is limiting because that you have to double check something. Again, PowerShell can be unidirectional. It doesn't tell you that, okay, this was successful and confirm that your operation completed exactly what you wanted it to. So we have a question here. Automation is a great concept, but the challenge is, how do we get test results that make it possible to make an informed decision that our intent is reflected in the results without a sandbox? So if I'm understanding this question correctly, I believe it's asking, how do you have confidence in changes if you haven't tested it in a sandbox? If that's the question, I would say you don't really. And that's why I emphasize the change management part of this, where you really need a dedicated tenant as a sandbox or what I would call a test environment, and you use automation to make sure that that test environment is a replica of production, so you actually have a valid place to test your configuration changes. And so as production changes over time, so does your test environment. They need to be as closely configured as possible, so you have a predictable and valid testing ground. So the answer would really be you can't. You need that dedicated testing environment. And I do want to make sure that answers the question for the person who sent that in the chat. Please feel free to send a follow-up if that did not answer your question. And any other questions, folks? We'll give about one more minute here and then we'll switch over to a quick demo. Definitely. The follow-up comment where it was that is the crux of the matter for many of you, certainly. And that's really why one of the number one reasons why CoreView Configuration Manager was initially created. We initially created the product in large part to help roll out changes to production environments. One of the founding stories actually is that Intune was about 6 years ago, give or take, and Intune was finally reaching maturity where we wanted to adopt it widely in our production environment for a few thousand devices, and we had Intune configured exactly how we wanted it to be configured in our test environment, and then we were going to go and recreate it in production. And as we approach that task, we realize, we shouldn't be manually recreating this environment when we already have it in test. It's configured how we want it to be, and we've tested it in a dedicated testing environment. And so the idea of Simian Cloud, now known as CoreView Configuration Manager, came to be to have a automation tool to be able to, with automation, move our configurations and settings from test to production with a logged approval process where we propose the change, someone reviews the change, someone approves the change, and okay, now we can see changes are coming across from test to prod. We don't want to be manually recreating those changes. So definitely it is an issue for you. And if change management is an issue for you, if Microsoft 365 configuration backup, standing up new tenants, baselining, if any of those resonate with you, I would strongly encourage you to take a closer look into CoreView Configuration Manager and see how that could help. Folks, I'm going to just take a quick transition here over to a brief product demo. I see Gustav is saying that your sandbox can mimic but can't be production level risks without that 100% confirmation. Absolutely. You really would need a tool that has continuous integration so you can continuously confirm and see that your sandbox is a replica of production. And there's really no way to do that manually. You would need either very sophisticated PowerShell scripts and pipelines or a third-party solution like CoreView Configuration Manager. Folks, so changing gears a little bit to our demo. Here we are on app.simiancloud.com. Of course, CoreView Configuration Manager was previously known as Simian Cloud, now known as Config Manager. And just to jump into this, this is a single-page web application, really a user interface that sits on top of Azure DevOps or GitHub, whatever your orchestration platform is in the back end. And then we have our user interface on top of this. As you can see, we have the ability to add a tenant. I can either add a baseline or add a downstream tenant. A baseline is a template tenant, as we said before, and a downstream tenant is a tenant that points to a baseline. Or your production tenant could be your baseline, and your non-production tenants could be your downstream tenant. So we add a downstream tenant. Let's say I call it simiancloud.com, or my downstream tenant is coreview.com. I can select a baseline called JDownstream13, and then I can select my authentication method. You can use a user, you can use a service principal, and so forth. And then I go ahead and hit add, and I follow the steps on the screen to install my tenant. Now, the first thing I do after my tenant is installed, and again, I'm installing my tenant pointing to a baseline, the first thing I do is I run a sync. And that initial sync takes a backup of all the configurations in your tenant, and then it does a comparison between the configurations in your tenant and the configurations in your baseline. And then to view that comparison, we go to reconcile. So reconcile is right here. I've preloaded the page in another tab, and I've selected my Uptown Cycles tenant. And as we can see, on the left pane here, I've selected Uptown Cycles, and I'm comparing it with my baseline. So I have Uptown Cycles compared with my baseline. And so reconcile is the process of comparing two tenant configurations and reconciling the differences. So we're able to use reconcile to more closely align our two tenants' configurations. And the way we're doing that is by viewing this diff or this comparison, which is represented by these 4 columns. So we have only in Uptown Cycles. These are configurations that exist only in my Uptown Cycles tenant. They do not exist in my baseline. I have some conditional access policies. I have some groups. And you can see that I can keep it checked to keep it in the tenant, or I can uncheck to remove it from the tenant. I can also see things like who last modified this configuration. I can hit load and see who last modified this. I can even view it in code if I want to get into that. I also have the ability to copy and move this configuration to other tenants. So a lot of power here, folks. Let's say this is my test tenant. It's not Uptown Cycles, it's test. And I have this demo policy I want to move to prod. I can say move to production and have this exact policy in my test environment now move to production. Second section we have is available from baseline. These are all of those configurations that exist in the baseline, but do not exist in my tenant. Or these could be configurations that exist in prod that don't exist in non-prod. If I was comparing non-prod to prod, this would be the difference. And let's say I wanted to get non-prod aligned with prod, I could go ahead and start selecting. Oh, this has a bunch of dependencies. I could go ahead and start selecting my configurations. Right, so this is essentially a catalog of configurations that I can select each of to deploy out to my tenant. So today, if you wanted to set up 1,128 configurations in your tenant, it would take hours and hours and hours to set that up. And then at the end of it, you wouldn't really have 100% confidence that it's configured the way you want it to be. With CoreView Configuration Manager, we can select configurations in bulk and deploy them out to our tenants in minutes. And again, this could be for prod to non-prod, non-prod to prod. It could be from a baseline to multiple tenants. We can deploy to many tenants at once. We have conflicting with baseline. This section contains configurations that exist in the tenant and the baseline, but they're configured differently. So here I have password reset. We can hit view and see on a property by property basis how these 2 configurations conflict. We can see for the password reset policy, mobile app code enabled. It is set to true in Uptown Cycles. So the mobile app code is enabled in Uptown Cycles, but it is set to false in the baseline. So maybe we want it to be disabled. We could select that for that one property. And finally, folks, we have matching baseline. As the name suggests, this section contains all of those configurations that are configured identically in my 2 tenants that I'm comparing. So of course, your goal with CoreView Configuration Manager is typically to get your tenant configurations aligned as closely with one another as possible, because that suggests that your tenant is compliant with the other tenant configurations you're comparing, whether that's a baseline, whether it's prod and non-prod. We really want matching configurations. And this page right here is the transparency and the confirmation that PowerShell scripts or in-house solutions just aren't giving you, right? This is showing us, hey, this is the state. This is the way my tenant is configured today, right? This is how it changed. This is how it's configured. Something else that I like to point out, we do have an export report here, so I can actually export this into a nice Excel sheet. You can white label it, etc. We can use this search functionality. So we actually have a fully indexed search built in to the web application here. And this is really one of my favorite features because you can search any component of any configuration and it will display the matching results. Let's say I search MFA. I can see all the conditional access policies that reference MFA as a control. I could even search a group name and it would display to me the groups, the configurations that are assigned to that group name. So very, very useful search functionality there. One other thing I'd like to show you before we wrap up here is how we do a backup and restore. So the way we do that is by comparing a tenant against itself at a previous point in time. So right now I'm comparing Uptown Cycles to my baseline. I can compare any 2 tenants with Simeon. With CoreView Configuration Manager, I can compare any 2 tenants. And I can even compare for backup and restore a tenant against itself at a previous point in time. So let's see if I can get this to load for us here. We have uptime cycles, compare to uptime cycles at master being the current version. And let's say I go back a few weeks to November 18th. Let's see if we've had any changes since November 18th. We can see the date there, what I selected. We'll just give this a moment here to load for us. And we can see we have a few changes. So only in uptime cycles master, these would be configurations that exist today that did not exist on that date. We have available from November 18th. So these are configurations that have been deleted since November 18th. They existed on November 18th, but they've since been deleted. So this is essentially a restore, what we would be doing here. We have test site, and I would want to restore that. And it has one dependent, and I would restore that as well. Right, so what we just saw is these are configurations that existed on November 18th. They do not exist today. Conflicting shows things that have changed. So they existed on November 18th. They exist today, but they have changed between those two dates. We can see how have they changed. Okay, this was set to false, so on and so forth. We can see how they've changed. We can revert to a point in time or keep it as is. And then, of course, matching means they have not changed. So this is showing us the diff of how our tenant configurations have changed over time with the ability to keep those changes or undo them. Now, of course, right, when I select these boxes, it's not like any changes have actually been applied. We do have a workflow where I need to click reconcile and sync now. Reconcile commits the changes to the repository, sync stages the change, and approve deploys the changes to the tenant. That's pretty much it for the high-level demo, folks. Of course, as you can imagine with any tool, as you get deeper into it, more and more functionality makes itself evident to you.
All right, thank you so much, David, for all of your insights. To build on these best practices that he talked about today, DataLink is offering a complimentary audit of your Microsoft 365 environment using CoreView tools. And what this is a read-only scan of your entire environment. It won't open or edit any files or anything, but it will give you unique insights to your entire environment that Microsoft's native tenant just can't provide on its own. And so it will, some of these things that it'll identify are misconfigurations, unused or underutilized license, and you're just analyzing your overall security. And so this would involve a scheduled call with us in which you'd receive a real-time walkthrough of your tenant, followed up with entire audit documentation with license optimization report. And you would also get to see some more of CoreView's tools that they offer. So this is an excellent opportunity to identify gaps, improve security, and find some opportunities for savings with those underutilized or unused licenses that you're paying for. And so if you would like to take advantage of this, you can contact us. David on the next slide has some of our contact information, or you can also just reply to our follow-up email after this meeting. So our follow-up email will also include a recording of today's session and a copy of the slide deck with our contact information as well. So if you'd like to revisit any of the insights we shared today. So thank you all so much for coming and joining us today. Thank you again to our partner CoreView, and we'll hope we get to talk to you guys soon.